Hey, what's up everyone? This is Vegetarian Zombie, and I want to welcome you back to my series, Beginning C# with Unity. In this episode, we're going to be diving into arrays, but before we do that, let's talk about the last assignment. In the last video, I gave you the task of creating a tip calculator. Let's go over that briefly. Here you can see we have Unity open, and I'm going to switch to MonoDevelop. Here's where we last left off. I'm first going to delete all these instance variables here, and I'm going to delete this code within onDisable. Now I'm going to create my tip calculator. This tip calculator will take two fields. First, it will take the total amount of the bill, and then it will take a percentage for how much you want to tip on top of that. Here we have a total amount and tip percentage. You'll notice that the total amount is an int. And the reason it's an int is because we're representing money by using cents. In the last video, I mentioned that if you use a floating point to represent money, ultimately you're going to run into precision errors. These precision errors will ultimately lose money. So we always want to represent this by using ints. The tip percentage represents the percentage of the actual tip, and we're representing this by using a float. Now I'm going to write the code in onDisable. First, you'll see I'm creating a variable called tip, and this tip is an integer. Now what I have to do is multiply the tip percentage times the total amount. But in this case, I'm multiplying two different types. I'm multiplying an int times a float. That's not going to fly, so I either have to cast the total amount to a float or the tip percentage to an int. In this case, since we're working with floats and we're working with percentages, I'm going to want to convert total amount to a float. You'll see here that now the total amount is a float, and it's multiplying by tip percentage, and this is exactly how we want it to work, except we're now returning a float. We actually want to cast this to an int. So what we want to do is cast the result of this operation to an int. The way we do this is first we put this operation within parentheses, then outside the parentheses, we cast it to an int. The reason we're using the tip as an integer is because we're not interested in the floating point information. We simply want this represented as a whole number. Now I'll print out the result. Here we have a string will be printed to the console that says your total balance is, and now I'm going to add the tip plus the total amount. Now, if I left this just as is, the tip variable and the total amount variable will be converted to strings. To add them together, we have to surround them by parentheses. Now these two will first be added, and then the result will be converted to a string. Let's see this in action. Here we're back in Unity, and you can see now we have our two fields, total amount and tip percentage. Total amount, we're just going to work, say, 1,000, which would be $10. And for tip percentage, we're going to be doing 0.2 for 20%. Now let's start our game. And I'm going to uncheck the cube to run this code. And here we have your total balance is $1,200. What I next would do is write some conversions to convert this balance into dollars and cents. But if we just look at this and we divide it by 100, you can see that this is $12, exactly as we would expect it to be. Okay, in this video, I'll be talking about arrays. And before we talk about arrays in the context of computer science, let's take a moment and discuss arrays in real life. After all, once you understand it in real life, it'll make a whole lot more sense when working in C#. So let's think about when you would actually see an array in real life. Well, The simplest place I can think of is your own house. Imagine, for instance, you wanted to go green. And to do that, you're going to buy some solar panels. Well, one solar panel isn't going to really help you out. You're going to be buying many solar panels. And when you buy these solar panels, you're going to arrange them in a contiguous line, or you're going to place them next to each other and so forth. And when you look at those solar panels, what do you call them? Well, you can call them solar panels, but oftentimes we call it a solar array. According to dictionary.com, an array is just an arrangement, an order of things. So we don't necessarily even need to talk even about solar arrays. We could have an array of books, an array of ants marching down the road. Although typically I don't think we'd ever use array of ants. But you can get what I'm saying in terms of this. It's just a grouping. So how does arrays work with C#? Okay, let's imagine we had a game. And in this game, we wanted to keep score. And this is a game we're building in Unity, and we want to have couch co-op. So we're going to have 5 different players. Well, can you think how you would record the score of each player? Knowing what you know now, you could simply create a variable for each player. You could have player 1 score, player 2 score, player 3 score, player 4 score, and player 5 score. And then you can increment those individual scores. But this approach is somewhat an inflexible one, because eventually players may drop in, players may drop out, or you may want to limit the amount of players further down the road. And when you do that, you're going to have to go back to your code and change these variables. In fact, if you're going back to your code months down the line, these variables, you may not even understand what they're meant to do. You may have player 5 score, and you have now limited it to player 2 players, but this variable, you're not too sure if you're referencing it elsewhere in the project or even if it has any significance anymore. So you may be hesitant to delete that. Well, there is a better way of storing this information, and you can store it in an array. Instead of having individual variables representing these scores, you can contain them within this grouping. And here's what an array looks like. It's just simply a collection of numbers, or in this case, numbers, but it can be a collection of anything else. For instance, you may want to have an array of game objects, or you may want to have an array of strings, for instance, to represent the names of each of those players. Each array has its own type. Let's take a closer look at arrays. An array has what is known as elements, and an element is something that goes inside of the array. So in the case of our scores, each score would go inside of the array, and that would be an element inside the array. An array has a size, and this size indicates how many values it can contain. So you can set, I want my array to contain 5 values, and which means it can contain 5 elements. 5 different scores can go inside of that array. When you want to access an element within the array, you do that by its index. And here's where things get a little bit tricky. Let's take a look at this array, and let's say we put a value of 20 in the first element of the array. Now, if you want to access that element, you would think you would access it through the first index, index 1. Well, you'd be incorrect. In computer science, we start counting with the 0. So the first index would be the 0 index. The second index would be the 1 index, and so on and so forth. In fact, you can tell the largest index in an array by the length of an array minus 1. It's a little bit weird getting used to 0 indexes and so forth, but once you do, it'll just be natural. And here's the thing, is that almost all computer languages out there, or at least computer languages that I've used, work with the 0 index. So here's how we define an array. The first thing you do is define the type. And again, an arrays can have any type. So you can put int, string, boolean, and so forth. The thing to keep in mind is that once you define an array of that type, you can't change it, nor can you put any other types into that array. So you can't have an array of int, string, boolean, you can only have an array of all ints or all bools and so forth. This is a great feature because the last thing you want to do is take elements out of the array and then expect them to be a different type. Meaning, if you have an array of all strings and you pulled one out thinking it was a bool, your program could crash. So first you designate the type, and then you're going to put an open bracket and a close bracket. This indicates that it's an array. Next, you're going to put the name of the variable. And whenever you use this array, of course, you're going to be using this variable to access the array. Then you'll put the equal sign, and now comes the keyword new. This is just saying I want to create a new array. An array is a type of object in C#, which is why we use the new keyword. And then we use the type again. So we say new int or new string and so forth. We put the open bracket, and within the open bracket, we put a number. And this number will determine how large the array can be. So if we put 5, it will contain 5 elements. And then we put a closing bracket and then the semicolon. Once you've set the size of the array, you cannot resize it. Meaning, if you set the size to 10 and now you need 20 spaces in that array, you're going to need to create a new array. And the same goes with shrinking the array too. If you have your array as size 10 and you need it to go to size 5, you'll need to create a new array, then copy those elements from the older array. Once you have an array, it's very simple accessing it. You simply put your variable and then use the bracket sign again. You put bracket in the index of what you want to access. So in this case, I could put 0 and then close bracket, and then you use it as a regular variable. You can also initialize arrays with numbers without having to count the size of the array. So imagine you have a set sequence of numbers that you want to put into the array. Well, to do this, you'd put the type followed by the brackets, followed by the name, and then equal sign, and then you're going to put an open brace. And then you can put in the numbers or values that you want to add to the array, and you separate them with a comma. When you're done, you put a close brace, and now you will have created a new array set to the size of the amount of numbers or types that you've included in those braces. So if I put in 5 numbers within those braces, then the size of that array would be 5. Arrays can be what is known as multidimensional, meaning you can have many different columns included in your array. The way you can think of this is like an Excel spreadsheet. The first column can be the row. The second column can indicate the first cell. The second column can indicate the second cell, and so forth. The way you would set up a multidimensional array is you would indicate the type, say as int, then you would put your open brace, and then you would put a comma. The comma indicates the amount of dimensions that you're using. By putting 1 comma, that means you're using 2 dimensions. You can put 2 commas, that would equal 3 dimensions, and so forth. You'd put your close bracket and then equal sign, and then new int, or the type that you're using, followed by the size of the amounts of these arrays. So I could put open bracket 2, close bracket, open bracket 3, close bracket. And this will create a multidimensional array. Multidimensional arrays can be somewhat confusing to think about. And once you start using multidimensional arrays more than 2, then you may find yourself quickly getting lost. There are actually other data structures that you can use to visualize what your code is doing. Personally, in my own career, I've had very few circumstances where I needed to use a multidimensional array. In fact, these days, I tend to prefer to use different data structures to hold my data so I can understand better what's going on at a glance. Okay, let's see how arrays work within Unity. I'm going to switch over to MonoDevelop. And here we have our code for our tip calculator. I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to create some new arrays up here. I'm going to create a new array to store my scores. So I can put int, and again, I'm going to put my bracket sign like this. This indicates that it's an array. I'm going to call this score. We'll call this scores like so. Then I'll put an equal sign, and now I'm going to create a new array. And I put new int, and we'll say create 3, like so. Now when I want to set these variables, I can simply set them like so. I can type scores and I put 0. This is the first element of the array. We'll say this person has a score of 403. The second person has a score of 200. And the last person has a score of, let's say they did very well. If I want to print out any of these scores, I could do it like so. And now I'll print out the score. Let's switch over to Unity and see this in action. Here we'll run, and we'll disable. The first person's score is 403. And again, we can also work with other types as well. In this case, I'm just going to define these values in a literal fashion. Here we have our names, Mike, James, and Pete. And I can just add this over here. Now I'm going to switch back to Unity. And there you can see, whoops, Mike's score is 403. We can actually use arrays inside of Unity. I'm going to create a new array. And we're going to make this an int. And we're going to call this lives. And I'm going to make this an array like so. Here you can see we have this now public, and I haven't declared anything at all. Now I'm going to switch back to Unity. And you'll see down here we have now a lives field. If I expand this disclosure triangle, you can see we have a size of 0. Let's make this a size of 5. And now you can see we have all these different elements that we can now just start adding. One of the great things about working with arrays inside of Unity is that Unity manages the arrays for us. If I don't want this element, I can simply delete this array element, and now that's gone. I can also select this element and hold down Command Delete like so, and that will also delete the array element. If I select this element here, I can duplicate it too, like so. Now some of you may be confused. Earlier in this video, I mentioned how arrays cannot be resized. Once you create an array, then that array is going to stay like that size throughout the lifetime of the program. Well, what's happening in this case is that Unity is managing the array for us. When we create a new element, what Unity is doing is it's actually creating a new array for us behind the scenes, and it's copying those values. But to us, it appears as though we are altering this or editing this array in real time. In a couple more episodes, we'll be diving into control flow, and you'll be seeing how useful arrays can really be. But for now, we're doing everything by hand. Well, that's the end of this video. But before you go, I have another task for you. In this task, I want you to create a bunch of scores. We'll say I want you to create 5 scores, and I want you to put them in an array that you can set in the Unity editor. And then when you disable that cube, like so, I want you to calculate the average of all those scores and print it to the console. Arrays are really powerful, and you'll be using them a lot. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me a message in the comments below. And in the next episode, what we'll be doing is recapping these previous episodes that we've gone through. We'll be covering all the things that we've learned, and then I'll be showing you where we're going to be going. Things are about to get interesting, so buckle up and hold on and enjoy the ride.